Much, Peter, and thank you very much for coming along today. I'm actually delighted to be here and have a chance to talk about the book, because one thing that sort of struck me when I sort of talked to my friends and told them that I had a book published. It's my first book published, and is I was expecting to be interested in what's it about, and if they have a copy, let me read it, But once you tell them the price of it, it's sort of bought, and that's and that's the end of their interest in it, And even the way I say, so I can get it for you half price, they're thinking, oh, well, £5, maybe I could stretch to a £5. No. So I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk about the content of the book rather than the cost of it, and who the hell would buy something off me, What I hope to do just for the next 20 minutes is the first part. I'll just give you sort of a brief overview of the book, and I'll talk a bit about sort of the structure and the methodology, and say a bit about just sort of like some of the problems that I've had in writing the book or had to overcome. And then for the second part, I'm really not going to be able to do justice to every aspect of the book. So what I'm going to do is just like hone in on one particular area, which I think might be of interest to you. So that's really what the structure is. So there'll be large parts of the book, and there's one large section which I deal with, looking at sort of early trade union movement combinations and journeyman societies in Dublin, which sort of was a very interesting period in the early 18th century for journeyman societies. Which I know Chris, you in particular, would have enjoyed. But if you're going to, if you want to know what I've said about it, you're going to have to get the book. Unfortunately, I'm not going to say much about that today. But maybe we'll have a conversation afterwards about it, or at another time. So for those of you who are familiar with this period, you'll know that this is not the first time a historian has examined law and order in 18th century Ireland. Stanley Palmer, Sean Connolly here, Neil Garham, and David Fleming, to name a few. However, I hope that this book actually offers something new. It explores the connection between collective action, popular politics and policing in Ireland from the end of the Williamite War in 1691 to the outbreak of White Boy agrarian protest in 1761. It considers the impact made by people who maintained order, outlining not only the many problems they faced, but also the effects on Irish society of their abuses. The book highlights the conflict between authorities who enforced laws and crowds who enforced, as such, popular notions of justice, as well as the changes taking place in the ethics of law enforcement. It shows how increasing taxes collected by the Irish government, used mainly to pay for the British Army, resulted in a proliferation of violent protests in most parts of Ireland in the early 18th century. In addition, the book discusses popular attitudes and belief systems, examines the conduct of rioters and members of the forces of order, and reveals moral compasses used during violent confrontations on both sides of the legal divide. Overall, the book's investigation of large-scale disorder leads us to a better understanding of the relationship between rulers and the ruled in Ireland in this period. The book challenges the opinion generally held by historians that popular violent disorder was uncommon in Ireland in the early 18th century. The acclaimed historian James Donnelly argued, nearly 40 years ago, that the early 1760s should be regarded as a watershed for rural popular protests. It was a time when agrarian protesters gave birth to a new and complex tradition of peasant protest. Before that, he goes on to say, there was no tradition of peasant revolt, no comprehensive moral economy of the poor, no elaborate system of frontier law to rival or supplant the hostile legal apparatus of the colonial state. And recently, David Dixon has argued in a collection of essays in honour of Sean Connolly here, that no collective protest movement in the Irish countryside caught the attention of Dublin Castle for 4 decades after the demise of the Hawkers. And the Hawkers ended riots for 1713, early 1714. However, it's evident now, I believe, that popular protests relating to issues such as collecting of taxes, corruption of the law, and the penal laws were a permanent feature of social relations in city and country from the 1710 onwards. Part 1 of this book, that's the first 3 chapters, investigates the resources utilised by the Irish government to enforce laws, in particular when authorities confronted large-scale disorder. It investigates the roles played by civil officers, like constables, watchmen, jailers, and revenue officers. The military, which included troops and militiamen, and also bands of irregular forces, which include people like bounty hunters. Examining the mainly Protestant men who defended the Protestant ascendancy from both internal and external threats casts light on wider aspects of Irish society. For example, did all Catholics join together in directly opposing the new political order after the Catholic King James II was defeated in Ireland in 1691, as some people in authority feared? If so, should all large-scale violence involving Catholics after 1692 be regarded as a proxy war, or as somebody referred to as a war of the flea, being waged by Irish Catholics against Protestant King William III and his successors? Alternatively, did Catholics try to adapt to the new political imperative after 1692 by ingratiating themselves with the local authorities and law enforcers who could provide them with work, protection and somewhere to live? If so, what happened to the process of cultural accommodation when controversial and unpopular laws such as the penal laws and tax raising legislation were more strictly enforced? So the first part examines how laws were enforced, particularly in the west of Ireland, where Protestants felt isolated and vulnerable to attack by bandits known as Tories and Rapparees, also Franco-Jacobite privateers in wartime and agrarian protesters. It explores the complex relationship that existed between the army and local gentry, using three examples of large-scale conflict. The Tory Wars in Munster in the 1690s and early 1700s. The Tory Wars is Tory as in bandits, not as in the political party, although there's arguably there's a Tory war going on at the moment, but that's another matter. Maybe you'll deal with that one later on. I don't know. So the Tory Wars of Munster, the agrarian and religious protests in Connaught in the early 1710s, and the taxation protests in Ireland in the period between 1720 and 1760. It also examines how irregular forces and militias were utilised in areas that were yet to come under full government control, such as in South Ulster, West Connaught and South Munster. Part 2 examines, this is the chapters 4 to 9, examines the different kinds of collective action that were undertaken by the lower social orders in Ireland. The method utilised here is different from Part 1, which looked at the forces of order mainly from the point of view of authorities in Ireland. Rather, collective action examined mainly from the perspective of people in the lower social orders. And shifting perspective places in a clearer light the different experiences and opinions amongst the populace, and the impact of state policy on popular ideologies in Ireland, and vice versa. History from below, or grassroots history, developed in the 1960s and 70s by historians like George Rude, Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson, sought to legitimise popular history by putting faces on the crowd. The approach, which I've utilised here in part, allows us to discover more about the culture of the crowd, how it behaved, how it was composed, how it was drawn into its activities, what it set out to achieve and how far its aims were realised. And added to that, of course, is how gender could affect the crowd. These chapters concentrate attention on the aspirations, motivations, culture and actions of people from the lower echelons of Irish society. Now, because people in early 18th century Ireland were getting accustomed to acting collectively, often with using force, considerable attention is given in this book to incidents of violence, or more precise, large-scale violence. However, this is not a study of violence or crowds per se. Incidents of violence between agents of the state and crowds of ordinary people were usually an indication that popular grievances concerning politics, religion and economic situations had been stirred up and substantial cracks had appeared in social relations. The reasons why people became involved in large-scale violence were varied. However, the book focuses readers' attention on groups of people who took direct action in order to defend customary rights or seek redress for perceived injustices. These include crowds in Dublin who protested against employers and law enforcers who suppressed collective action in the workplace and confronted corruption of the law. Also, people could respond violently when soldiers and revenue officers, the military and fiscal arms of the state, when they operated more effectively in places where people had become accustomed to not paying the full amount in taxes. And normally there were not enough coercive resources in situ to deal with people who had broken laws. This part of the book contains a qualitative and quantitative analysis of riot and rescue, which is identified as the most common type of popular protest in early 18th century Ireland. I contend here that the people who were involved in riot and rescue were legitimised by the belief that they were defending traditional rights or customs and had the support of the community to which they belonged. As such, this book is much more than an examination of riots and policing or order and disorder in Ireland. In essence, it casts light upon the complex relationships that existed between different groups of people in Irish society, in particular between Catholics, Protestants and dissenters, the lower, middle and higher social orders, and women and men. So, as I say, there's many aspects of the book that I could have focused on, but I decided I'd actually like to focus on this behaviour which I've sort of referred to as riot and rescue. It's also known as assault and rescue or just rescue, and offer you now a radically different view of popular protests in 18th century Ireland. What is riot and rescue? Well, as the name suggests, it comprised of two elements: the coordinated attack by crowds, composed of smugglers, illicit distillers, urban gangs and others, on government officials, most notably revenue officers, soldiers and jailers, and the rescue from their possession of smuggled goods, equipment, distresses or prisoners. The rescue of property by the mob, the so-called mob, was similar in effect to the legal form of redress known as replevin, which was the right in common law for a person to recover confiscated goods from authorities prior to a court determining who had lawful ownership. It's not the same thing. Rescue and replevin are not the same thing. The reason why I mentioned replevin is it gives there was a connection, I feel, in the minds of some people to what they were doing, which was strictly illegal, and what could be achieved through legal channels. So I'm not saying that the two things are the same, I'm just saying that there is a connection. So what I would like you to do now, just for a few minutes, is to give you a few examples of the type of material, the type of examples of riot and rescue, using the material that I research that I undertook when I was working in London. And this here, it comes from the Irish Revenue Commissioner Minute Books, which are held in the National Archives at Kew. You probably can't read that, but don't worry, I'll translate it. And it needs to be translated, actually, it is in English, but with all the abbreviations that they use in that sort of 18th century language, it can be difficult to read. But the reason why I put this up here was because the story is it's a letter that's written from Kilkelly in County Mayo in 1725, written to the commissioners who were based in Dublin. And what it says here, and if you can't read it clearly, they were complaining that the compounders, who were sort of a class of people who were producing alcohol, who would not comply. What it says they won't comply with any terms. In other words, they weren't prepared to pay any tax. And when the surveyor went there to make his survey, find out how much alcohol that they were producing, people got intelligence of their coming and had removed all their drink out of their houses, and gathered a mob of 100 persons from the mountains in order to stone the surveyor and his assistants if they would offer to distrain for arrears. So they obviously got winds of the fact that the surveyor was travelling round, which of course then draws us to think, well, how did that happen? Was there some collusion between maybe the lower ranks of the revenue officers who were giving information, selling information, or was it forced out of them? They were given information about the impending survey. It also tells us something about the fact that it gives us an idea of the numbers of people who are involved, reference to 100 persons from the mountains. Now, of course, this is a coded language that's often used, that the mountain people. It's often used as a derogatory term, making reference in many cases to people who either live beyond the law or who are actual outlaws, and most likely to be Gaelic Irish as well. So that there's so that we can read something into the language and the references made there. It says the inhabitants refused to provide drink, lodgings, and hay and oats for the people who were providing the inquiry, who were involved in the inquiry. And again, that draws us to say to see that it wasn't just violence that people use as a way of resisting or protesting against taxation, but they could actually be done through non-violent means as well. And so you've seen many examples of this sort of like non-violent, which is referred, the anthropologist J.C. Scott referred to as weapons of the weak. These were people who were desperately poor, who were using whatever methods that they could in order to sustain their own lives or to resist against authorities. And so that's quite possibly an example of that. And towards the end, as we move down, there is talk about the frustration of the revenue officers, the fact that people are being asked to come into the office and give evidence, and people are saying, no, we're not going, we're not going to come along. They said, well, the only way that we can get any money out of this shower is if we bring in the army. So that's basically all that information is contained within this one short paragraph. This comes from a series of books, which there are many, probably tens of thousands of pages, describing the day-to-day function of revenue officers in Ireland during the whole of the 18th century. And that gives you some idea of the information that you can get from those sources, and how, by reading between the lines and maybe comparing this to collating all the information from other places and throughout the whole time period, we can gather together sort of a picture. We can create a picture of the culture of the protesters. So I thought I would show you that. Here's another example of Strabane in 1736. This is there's a lot less detail in this. This is reference to a place, Ballinagallea, which is the Gallia. It's just outside Derry. It's actually part of Derry, but it was where Moses Thompson, who was a gauger, and he got information that there was illegal production of whiskey in that townland. And when he went he seized some of that whiskey, but he couldn't find the stills. He was annoyed about that, but at least he got the whiskey. But in response to that, he said that there was, when he was looking to bring the seizure away, the mob rose and attempted to rescue it, and in the affray many of his assistants were wounded. And that sort of gives you an example of this type of, again, the information. We know that there was violence. There's a sense, we don't really sense of the numbers, it doesn't tell you exactly how many people were involved, but we know there was violence. We know that the importance of alcohol and the stills in this situation, and we know that as well, the fact that this letter was sent to the revenue commissioners was really because they were looking to get money out of the revenue commissioners to help pay for the care of the people who were injured. And if they weren't actually injured, we probably wouldn't have heard about that incident at all. So it may be an indication that we have an underestimate of the numbers. I'll talk about those in a minute. And lastly, I want to tell you this one briefly because I think it's of particular interest. This took place in Buncrana, this incident in Donegal in 1755, and it makes reference to a revenue officer who was carrying out a rummage, which is sort of like a search of the town, looking for run goods, smuggled goods. And it talks about that a crowd of around 200 to 300 people descended upon him, and that men in women's clothes appeared, armed with guns, spits, and other offensive weapons, and put him in great fear of his life. And the reason why I wanted to include that, because it's this idea of men dressing in women's clothes to carry out these attacks and rescues. It didn't happen often, but it happened enough to realise that there were, in different parts of the country, for me to conclude that, you know, obviously that there is some pattern, there was some pattern there. I wouldn't say maybe once a year or even less than that you'd have a record of men being dressed as women, and there's some analysis about how that sort of fits in with what was going on in Europe and other countries in Europe. And some analysis, was it just because men dressing women just for the case they didn't want to be recognised? Was it that they were less likely to be shot by authorities if they thought they were women? Were they sending out a message to people who were saying that we are going to break the normal protocol of riot? You know, are we, i.e., we're prepared to kill you? So hence the revenue officer making a big point of saying I was in great fear of my life because I saw this as a threat. So I'll just give the 3 examples really to give you a taste of the type of material that I've been using, give you a sense of what the book was about. Right, it's contended in the book that these riots contain many common characteristics regarding the role of women and men, treatment of informers, and the level of violence. Yet every explosive event was triggered by what were essentially local grievances. Sometimes many hundreds of people joined together in mobs in order to rescue goods confiscated by revenue officers, but there's no evidence to suggest that there was a countrywide coordination. Taxation rioters in Ireland were expressing a sense of legitimacy for their protests, similar to that of food riots in England, studied by E.P. Thompson and others. As in England, rioters in Ireland were legitimised by the belief that they were defending traditional rights or customs and had the support for the community to which they belonged. Incidents of riot and rescue occurred all over Ireland in all 4 provinces. They peaked in periods sort of the mid-1720s, the early 1730s, and also the late 1740s and early 1750s. And it's not surprising to note that most instances of riot and rescue recorded in the minute books tended to be prevalent in counties where smuggling was widespread, in particular Antrim, Cork, Dublin, Donegal, Galway, and Limerick, and so on. Fewer instances were recorded in those parts of Ireland where smuggling were less common. That was certainly the case before 1740s. There were none documented in Fermanagh in Kings County, Leitrim, Tipperary, Westmeath, and only 1 or 2 in places like Longford and Cavan, Monaghan. But that things tended to change. You can't really see it. I'm not sure if you can see it, it's clear enough. This is really just to give you an indication of where the riot and rescue disturbances were concentrated. This map here is up from 1717 to 1739. And then this map gives an indication of where the concentration of disturbances between 1740 and 1761. And you can see from there, you can see that the areas around the coast always remain quite high, in where smuggling was prevalent. But what you see then after 1740 is a greater concentration of riot and rescues in sort of midland areas. And the reasons for that, I think, are twofold. I think first of all that with the outbreak of the War of the Austrian Succession and then the 7 Years' War, there was less opportunities for merchants to smuggle, and there were either because there was more privateering and there was greater naval activity going on around the country, or else it's just that the people who did the smuggling were engaged in privateering. It was easier money. But also that the governments themselves were looking to try and get as much money out of the production of home-produced alcohol, and so that's the reason why you see a lot more activity in the Midlands. So I'm going to finish off very soon. I'm going to say just a few words by way of conclusion about this form of protest. The violence that was meted out by 2 revenue officers by the mob occurred where problems associated with national policy changes, i.e. taxation and also reorganisation of revenue officers, were exacerbated by local circumstances. Fundamentally, the level of violence was connected to the revenue-raising strategy progressively introduced by the revenue commissioners from the 1710s, which sought to increase the king's coffers from the money raised from import and export duties and inland excise. However, other factors could and did make an impact on the level of violence on a local level. In particular, the relationship between traders and revenue officers was important. Violence could be avoided if officers turned a blind eye to illegal activity, or there were not enough officers employed in a district to discover it. And of course, there were many instances where officers took bribes or colluded with illegal traders. It also might be argued these protests, in particular instances of riot and rescue connected to smuggling, were manifestations of popular Jacobitism in Ireland. The Franco-Irish privateers operating in wartime were often the same people who, after the war ended, smuggled goods in and out of Ireland. Moreover, according to Paul Monod, there were widespread collusion between smugglers and Jacobites in the southeast of England in the same period. However, support for Jacobitism was not a principal cause of outbreaks of taxation riots in Ireland. Catholics, Episcopalians and dissenters from diverse social backgrounds and with different political allegiances could and did all become smugglers in Ireland. Some showed sympathy for the Jacobite cause, such as merchants who smuggled goods into Ireland and then took men away to join the Jacobite army in France. But the same could not be said for people such as groups of Presbyterians in Temple Patrick, who also engaged in riot and rescue, and also some of the higher social orders were involved in. There's a number of records, there's a number of pieces of evidence to indicate that people who, even MPs and churchmen, were involved in smuggling. And also, I'd say, the proliferation of popular protests in the early 18th century did not signify revolution. John Bowstead, the historian, made a similar point when describing comparable events taking place in England at the end of the century, and I really like this quote, observing that, quote, hundreds of riots did not add up to a revolutionary sum. Also, there's very little evidence that the Revenue Commission in many books indicate that smugglers or other illegal traders in Ireland behaved differently when the Jacobite uprising began in Scotland in 1745. If there was a strong connection between the Jacobite uprising and anti-taxation protests, it would be reasonable to assume there'd be an upsurge in incidents of riot and rescue at that time. But between 1744 and 1746, there was no such increase in the number of riot and rescues, nor attacks on revenue officers in Ireland. And the strong impression left by the revenue commissioners at that time was that it was basically business as usual, at least in relation to raising of taxes. Overall then, in this book I have made use of a wide range of primary sources, collected mostly from archives in England and in Ireland, an extensive body of secondary sources, including extracts of historical material in Irish. I do not claim to have looked at everything or provide a complete picture of all forms of popular protest and collective action, but what I have discovered, I hope, illuminates a new way both popular mentalities in city and country and the nature of popular involvement in economic and political struggles. Thank you very much. Oh, buy the book. Buy the book. Buy the book.
To get you a discount on the book.
Right? I can get you a discount on the book if you want. Talk to me afterwards. It's very cheap. No, it's very good value. It's not cheap. It's very good value.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
That was great. So, Chris, when you're ready.
Okay, well, I have to follow up from Tim and his speech about his book there now and everything, okay? So, first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Gray and the Institute of Irish Studies for inviting me along. As Tim was saying as well, it's genuinely a delight to be here to speak to you all about the work that the research that I conducted while I was here, and then how that contributed as well to then the final book that came out last year in March, last year as well. I mean, Professor Gray and the staff in the history department, full stop, played a very important role in all the research and the work that I did that went into this book, because it was originally an AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council fellowship that paid for studentship, that paid for the research that formed the basis of the book itself as well. And that's it's in the acknowledgements about all those things as well and everything. I'm now teaching at Newcastle University at the moment. So one of the reasons why it's a delight to speak about this book is that the people that have gone through this book in the most depth so far have been a group of third-year undergraduates at Newcastle University. And hopefully your comments will be nicer than the comments I got from the third-year undergraduates. Because the third-year undergraduates, I was expecting that they would think that, oh, well, this is someone important. We shouldn't criticise their book too heavily. We want to be nice to them. I found it was exactly the opposite, that they felt they had to criticise as much as possible to help your work in that kind of sense. So I wasn't quite expecting how well they criticised the work about it. For instance, the great bit of feedback I got back was, it shouldn't be blue. Was one of the first bits of feedback that I got about it, that it shouldn't be blue. They were adamant that actually they thought it should be red in colour for the cover, because it was about the labour movement. And so that was one of the first things that I kind of realised, well, okay, people definitely do judge books by the covers. Didn't quite realise that until that question was given and everything, okay? But so far, as I said, apart from the third-year undergraduates, the reviewers and the publishers have read it, so there's a select group that have read it. And so where the book itself actually kind of comes from, where it sits essentially as a book, is really about the first 20 years of Northern Ireland as a state. It's really a case study about what happened in the first 20 years after the state was created in 1921, and specifically looking through a case study or case studies about the labour movement in Belfast, and how the labour movement in Belfast actually dealt with the problems of creating the new state and what actually occurred at that stage. And that's really what it's then sitting within, and within the kind of history and historiography that's within. And the most important book that's really been written about that period, or the two most important books that have been written about that period, are really Patrick Buckland's book about the Factory of Grievances, which is from a quote by a civil servant at the time, the head of the civil service at the time, about that was all Northern Ireland was good for. The other book that's very important, and as important as that book, is really Hugh Gibbon and Patterson's book, Northern Ireland Political Forces and Social Classes. And the thing about why that Hugh Gibbon and Patterson book is so important is because it's encapsulating a lot of the 1960s history from below and radical theory that was going around at the time, and specifically the Althusserian Marxist kind of view of these kind of things actually. And that's where that would have been the Althusserian view of Marxism, the idea of Marxism as a structure and structuralist analysis about those things, was really what shaped Hugh Gibbon and Patterson's views of these kind of things. Now, as Tim was talking about with E.P. Thompson, that's really where the difference of the book, of what I'm talking about, and the analysis that I present is different about this, where it's really taking a Thompsonian Marxist approach to these kind of things, and it's essentially a culturalist Marxist approach to these kind of things that you're really looking at. So one of the things that I found whenever I went to do the research, I never started as a naive young researcher at Queen's University of Belfast. Starting my PhD, I thought, I'm going to go and research the labour movement in Belfast. I'm going to go to the archives and find out what's in there. And we'll find out lots of things about sectarianism. Find out a lot of things about Protestant and Catholics hating each other and Protestant and Catholics discriminating against each other. We'll find lots of things like that. And whenever I went to the archive and started looking in the archive, I found that there wasn't as much of that kind of stuff as I thought there would be actually. And the way that a lot of that stuff occurs and the way that it's talked about in the archives is with euphemisms. The kind of thing that Tim was noting there about the words they use, like the mountain and hillside men. In the 19th century, they would have talked about the hillside men. And there's lovely euphemisms about these kind of things. And that's really where the labour and the politics of disloyalty emerges, because that's the key word or the coded phrase that I kind of found within a lot of the government documents about this thing, where they would have talked about disloyalty, rather than saying that someone's a Catholic and they don't like them, or rather than saying someone's a labourist or a communist or a socialist that you dislike. They would have said in the government archive, about the government documents, that they're actually a disloyalist, they're disloyal, and hence on that basis we don't like them, or they're getting fired from their job. And that's where the words come in about this, or the linguistics come into this, and that's really where then the book itself, The Moral Economy of Loyalty, is coming from, because that construction of how they talked about the labour movement and how they talked about people they disliked in Northern Ireland, that's where the disloyal actually comes into this. Now, one of the things that, when I talk about the book as well, it's important to register, is the only reason we know enough to write one book about the interwar Belfast labour movement is because of the police. Because during the Second World War, when the Blitz happens, all the trade unions that are talked about here that were Northern Ireland based, their headquarters, a lot of them were up on York Street. So Northern Ireland Labour Party's headquarters as well were on York Street. And because the York Street spinning mill gets blown up during the Blitz itself, there's lots of eyewitness accounts about just documents getting thrown everywhere, and an awful lot of the labour movement documents actually don't exist. So what does exist for the interwar period about the labour movement actually is a lot of documents from the police about specifically police being at labour movement meetings and noting them down by shorthand. And there's lovely documents in the archive as well, where the speaker at a labour movement meeting will stand at the front and thank the policeman with making the shorthand notes of the meeting. And you just get lovely images then in your mind's eye of a labour movement speaker saying, thanks for taking it in shorthand, and the shorthand note writer will be writing it down in shorthand to then go back to the RUC station to then type it all up, and then it was signed off and put into the archives. So that's one of the things, if you read about any of the anti-radical government programs that are on at the moment, always bear in mind that there may be a reason why we do want anti-radical programs by the government, because actually sources for the future historian may well come from these kind of things that we do. Well, actually, in that kind of sense, because this is where it fits very closely, my own book and my own work, with what Tim is talking about in terms of law, in terms of disorder and order, because that's really what in the 1920s and 30s is going on, I think, is they're trying to recreate some kind of an order. And they're trying to create a new state in Northern Ireland at that stage. And what they end up creating, or what they tried to do, was actually created a state. It's a new state, but it's using old traditions, and it's using old positions and old ideas. And that's really where the title of the book as well comes from, about a moral economy of loyalty, is that actually when you go back, whenever I went into the archive, I expected to find stuff about factories and the working class and the labour movement and Marxist kind of terms about things. I expected to find things like that. Whereas when you went to the archive, what stuck out to me about the sources and about the material that I was looking at wasn't how modern these people were at all. It was explicitly the opposite. It was how old-fashioned these people actually were. It was how old-fashioned the language was that they were using. It was how unlike the modern world the language was that they were actually using, that it was far more like an early modern conception about these things, and it was a far more early modern inflected use of the language. And that's really what I think comes from the case studies about the labour movement, is that there's actually what they were living through is a democratised enchant regime. And this is very much an enchant regime of 19th century British imperialism, of that British imperial state, of Britain at the height of its power, but through a self-governing society, through a laissez-faire kind of conception about these things. So it's actually quite backward looking in that kind of sense. And that's where I think a lot of the history becomes so important to these things, because that's the way this portrays everything at the time, is it doesn't show the modernity, it doesn't show the kind of working class communistic revolution that's going on at that stage. And that's where I think the enchant regime aspects become important. But the actual book itself, so that's the kind of broader context of what the book is responding to and why it's talking about these kind of things. Well, it's case studies about the labour movement in the 1920s and 30s, and specifically it's just case studies about the Belfast labour movement and really the political expressions of the labour movement at that stage. And one of the important things about this as a book, I think, is that it takes working class culture and working class politics seriously on its own terms. Is that it's not trying to actually say that these people were any greater or lesser than they were, but it's that actually the ideas that they had and they talked about, and the ideas that they expressed, that they wrote about in newspapers, that they spoke about at meetings, that all of those have a legitimacy in terms of being their own understandings of what was going on. That they were writing about these things and that they were living at the time, and that we weren't, in that kind of sense. And that's really the key aspect about it, I think, and that's really where it fits with the E.P. Thompson stuff that Tim was talking about, that we're trying to rescue these people from the enormous condescension of posterity. And what we mean by that is we're trying to stop from thinking that we knew better than they do, that we're cleverer than those societies or populations in the past, because we don't know that we're better. We don't know that we have more information or that we are more intelligent. And that's one of the kind of open questions, I think, about history. And that's the open question about why we want to look at the past. So the actual structure of the book, because that's the wider context I was saying. Well, the first chapter just sets up the historiography in terms of who's written about the period in the 1920s and 30s, about Buckland and Buchanan and Patterson, but also about the Third Home Rule crisis and before the First World War, what happens in the First World War, and how that shaped the contours and the context of all of these, of this kind of period, and of the post-partition period specifically that we're talking about as well. Now, the moral economy of loyalty as a term is really saying about how there is a value, and there's a culture and a politics all tied up to what they would have said and what they would have meant by loyalty. And that's one of the kind of interesting aspects as well, I think, about this kind of term about loyalty at this stage, is that this book is purely about intra-Northern Ireland. It's only about what was going on in Northern Ireland, and specifically one place of Belfast during the interwar period. But where that fits within wider then British Empire conceptions of loyalty, wider terminology of the idea of loyalty becomes quite important, because how much that's linked to the early modern world, I don't know. It's an open question. I actually think about that. But to me, there is some significance that within the British Empire, lots of the different wars that were fought, civil wars and rebellions that would have been fought, the people that supported the British Empire often go by the word and the term loyalist and loyal. And even on the War Memorial outside Queen's, outside the First and Second World War, it ends with loyal service. And I think that loyalty and the term loyal is actually an Anglophone term, and it may well be part of the Atlantic world, and then moving into the global 19th century as well. And there's open questions, I think, about that, but that's where the term loyalty, I think, is quite important about these kind of things, and where it links to the empire. Now that's chapter 1 in the book. Chapter 2 moves on to think about the labour movement itself, and about how the labour movement thought about nationality, and specifically how labour movement activists would have thought about whether they were British or they were Irish, why the trade unions had bases in Britain and in Southern Ireland as well, how the unions actually were set within that as well, because Marx and Engels had talked about that issue. They talked about whether Ireland should have independence or not, and whether labour activists should be in favour of Irish independence or not. That idea about Irish independence and the left wing supporting it, that's what James Connolly would also have supported, and there's a very famous Connolly-Walker debate before the First World War about whether there should be an independent Irish Labour Party, or whether the Irish labour movement should be part of the British labour movement and part of the British Labour Party as well. And those divisions of a labour movement which is both looking to London and also looking to Dublin, that's what you end up in the interwar period having, is you have a labour movement that's intersecting, or that has both aspects of it looking to different areas outside of Northern Ireland, where some are looking to the southern state and some are looking to London instead as well. And then you have a third group of Northern Irish trade unionists as well that are also there too. And so that's the first chapter, looks at questions of sectarianism, questions of national identity, because it goes on to look at the sectarian violence before the First World War that had occurred in Belfast recurringly in the later 19th century, but also then look at the interwar period and the different outbreaks of sectarian conflict and violence. I use those terms conflict and violence because conflict is used in social scientific terms to talk about things that are less than civil war, less than explicit political violence. So conflict really refers to strikes or boycotts or intimidation or confrontation person to person, but that doesn't actually have violent actions between the people as well. In that same chapter, we also look at how the activists in the labour movement, what was the religious basis, and essentially what it shows is that claims about the labour movement in Northern Ireland being a majority Protestant are reflected in the activists of the Belfast labour movement. That most of the activists in the labour movement we know of were from the Protestant side of the community. And the reason why that would be quite commonsensical or fits is because that's where the better paid jobs and the better paid respectable working class jobs would have usually been concentrated in the Protestant side of the community as well. And in the labour movement in Britain, for instance, those kind of demarcations within the working class and amongst the working class people wouldn't have had the same kind of sectarian connotations, but in Glasgow they did have the same sectarian connotations. In Liverpool they would have had the same sectarian connotations that they had in Belfast as well. And so again, there's aspects where this flows into other places across the British Isles as well in terms of the relationships that were going on. The key thing about the Belfast labour movement in that book, I think that I actually claim about it, is that criticisms that the Belfast labour movement didn't deal with the national question are essentially illegitimate. That whenever we criticise the Belfast labour movement for failing to deal with ethnic national division, of sectarian national division amongst working class people, we're criticising our own society as much as we're criticising them, because there's no proof that we have solved those issues that we're criticising them for. And specifically, an awful lot of things tied up with sectarianism about this that are important are in the historiography. It's often said that sectarianism, that ethno-national religious conflict between people, stops class politics. The reason why the Irish Labour Party has never been as successful as the British Labour Party is to do with the different industrial makeup and industrial structures of Southern Ireland. The reason why the Northern Ireland Labour Party was never successful is because of sectarianism. Sectarianism was essentially the master card, the master narrative that was played against the labour movement, that divided the labour movement. The problem is that if we go to any, or sorry, not any, but the vast majority of countries across the globe and look at their labour movements, they all reside within countries that have some kind of a religious division or some kind of a religious demarcation linked to their national identity as well. So it's not that unique at all to have a complex religious division or complex religious questions tied up with your labour movement, actually. It's actually quite common to have those kind of things. For instance, if you go to Holland or the Netherlands has a process of pillarization, they would call, whereby the different sectors of civil society are pillarized, whereby Protestants and Catholics are essentially divided, and that the liberal state sector is essentially a Protestant, a de facto Protestant sector, and the Catholic pillar is a separate pillar as well. And so in that second chapter, it really talks a lot about that sectarianism and what was going on with the labour movement itself. In the third chapter, it goes on to talk about electoral politics. And the key thing to just say to you about the electoral politics is that what goes on with the Belfast labour movement, for example, is not that they lose votes. So that's a table that shows you the number of votes that Northern Irish Parliament election candidates got in Northern Ireland for the Northern Ireland Labour Party. And you can see it was consistently the same. The difference is that in 1925 they get 3 MPs here for the Northern Ireland Parliament, whereas they got 1 MP there. And evermore, they only ever got 1 MP until after the Second World War period in the 1960s. And the reason is because they changed the electoral system from single transferable vote to first past the post. And that's the key conclusion of that electoral politics chapter, is to really say that the reason why the labour movement fails electorally is to do with the first past the post system. Because if they'd kept proportional representation for local elections, then the labour movement would have got at least 5 times, 6 times the number of local councillors regularly, whereas they had changed the electoral system. And the electoral system compounded then under-representation of the labour movement itself. For instance, in 1920, the Labour parties across Ireland got 20% of the local election vote. So they got 1 in 5 of the votes. Into the mid-1920s, the Belfast Labour Party, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, is getting similar kinds of votes, but is getting 2 councillors returned, whereas it got 12 councillors returned in 1920. And so the electoral system itself compounded a lot of the issues for the Labour parties and the Northern Ireland Labour Party as well itself. That was combined with the constituencies that were changed, and it was the Ulster Unionist Party that controlled those constituency changes because Republicans and Nationalists boycotted the Lease Commission itself. They also put up the deposit in terms of how much money you had to put up to stand for election. So the deposit at the beginning of the interwar period was £5 to stand in a local election. It's changed in the mid-1920s to £25. And that level of change, whenever you go through the documents of the Belfast labour movement, that had a serious impact on the labour movement itself. And so really, what you see in that electoral politics chapter is about how the rules of the game weren't set by the labour movement. The rules of the game were set by the unionist government itself. They had a majority in the local parliament and they could pass laws when they so deemed it fit. And that's essentially the reason why the labour movement failed, is because they were locked out from political power in that kind of sense. But one of the things that a lot of people have said about the unionists is that they were hegemonic, okay, that they had complete and utter control over Northern Ireland. A very famous thesis by McGarry and O'Leary is of the ethnic conflict zone interpretation of Northern Ireland, where they say that the unionists ruled by having a process of hegemonic control, whereby you couldn't rebel against them. And really what I think is going on with the unionists is a dominance is going on. that it wasn't actually hegemonic, that they always had to continually dominate and they had to continually keep themselves in power. And that's the problem. Because if you have to continually keep yourself in power, then you're not hegemonic. If you keep yourself in power without persuading anyone, you're hegemonic. Because it's totally common sense that you're in power. Nobody would question it in that kind of sense. I'll finish up now very quickly by talking about chapter 4 and 5. Because chapter 4 talks about the labour movement and bits of law with the Special Powers Act and the Trade Disputes Act. Now, these two bits of law were pieces of legislation that controlled space. It controlled where you could go, what you could print, what you could do with the Special Powers Act. And the Trade Disputes Act was a similar kind of one for industrial relations that's brought in after the general strike. One of the really fascinating facts that I'm trying to track down is in 1925 you have in the Northern Ireland Cabinet Papers a Secret Transport and Supply Committee. And in the Cabinet Papers it says about how we need to keep this Secret Transport and Supply Committee ongoing. But that's the last reference to the Secret Transport and Supply Committee after that. And I wonder whether that Secret Transport and Supply Committee was used during the general strike as the basis to control or to make sure Northern Ireland didn't have an emergency during the general strike. Because the general strike had very little impact on Northern Ireland. It crippled most of Britain, but there was only one group of dockers that ever went on strike in support of the general strike as a whole. The penultimate chapter in this book is about women's position within the labour movement and what was going on. And you can see an expression of the moral economy of loyalty that I'm trying to tell you about really in the picture here that we have of Queen of the May 1929. So whenever the Representation of People Act came in 1918, they only gave the vote to women over the age of 30. So then in the late 1920s, they had to then equalise the franchise, and there's a great debate in the Daily Mail all about this, a great moral panic in the Daily Mail all about this called the flapper vote, which almost sounds offensive whenever you say it today about the flapper vote. But they had a whole moral panic about the young woman dressed in a short pencil skirt and with looking very modern in that kind of sense. And just in this picture, the background shows you Unionist on one placard and then opposition. And that's it. There are only two options in Northern Ireland. There's Unionist or there's opposition. And that's essentially what I might mean by that moral economy of loyalty, is that there are only two sides. That binary sum, that zero-sum conception is really what's going on. There's also a great Markowitz quote in here, Countess Markowitz quote. At the launching of the Irish Women Workers' Union in Dublin in 1911, she says that the aim of the Irish Workers' Women's Union to a group of women is to make men of you all. Okay? Because she's saying that the franchise itself is male, politics is male, we're trying to metaphorically make you men. And that's where the chapter in the book talks about then the Belfast labour movement and how female agency, how women's agency was expressed in the labour movement itself as well. And there is good documentation about women in the labour movement at that stage. They would have played an important role, especially in the textile workers' unions. They weren't unionised, women as a whole, but there are significant sections of them that are unionised, and it's those sections that are unionised in this period that you'll then see actually in the Second World War and afterwards become very important in unionisation struggle at that period. So for example, Sadie Patterson is an important woman, female trade unionist in the interwar period itself, becoming a female trade unionist at that stage. In the Second World War, she'll be working in the ATGWU with Ernest Bevin, the Minister for Labour, for example, and was very kind of important in the moral rearmament movement that occurs after the Second World War. She was an evangelical Christian, Sadie Patterson. The last thing to talk to you about just in that penultimate chapter is just about the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Acts of 1919. Because what the book is talking about both revolution in Ireland at this period, but particularly counter-revolution in Ireland. Because that's really what occurs in Northern Ireland, I think, in this period, is Unionist counter-revolution, is British counter-revolution. And one of these elements of counter-revolution was the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Acts. Now, the Treasury and trade unions came to an agreement in 1915 to relax trade union restrictions, craft restrictions as they were known in the workplace. They would reduce those and allow them out of the picture for the duration of the war on the basis that they'd be reintroduced after the war. The real Treasury Agreement of 1915, that's where the munitionettes and where a lot of the female workers in the munitions industries come in at that stage because they're allowed into skilled male working class occupations. The Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act in 1919 kicks women out of those specific areas of employment. And what we know about it so far is that that Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act is essentially accepted. Most people accepted, oh well, okay, it was the war, men went and fought abroad, the women went into the factory, but now it's after the war, you're going out of the factory again, or certain male occupations you're now being excluded from again. There are marriage bars brought in the interwar period as well, and this is where that revolution and counter-revolution comes in, is that socially as well as politically there are revolutions and counter-revolutions going on in this period. You have female political agency expressed and allowed in Northern Ireland as soon as the state is set up, but at the same time you have women being excluded from certain areas of employment, marriage bars kept, and so female agency is also restricted in certain ways that then appear very restrictive to us as well now in the present too. The last thing to conclude on is where the future research has gone, because one of the things about doing the research about the Belfast movement I came across is in the late 1930s, the few communists you have in Belfast begin to say about how the way to get rid of the unionist monopoly of power is to have a progressive government at Stormont. And they call for a popular front type of government at Stormont that will be everyone who's anti-unionist, just against the unionists. And they talk about that idea of a progressive government at Stormont as a way to get democratic rights in Northern Ireland. So the way to get rid of the Special Powers Act, which I said about in chapter 4, it concentrates on looking at, they say the communists in the late 1930s that the way to get rid of that is to have a progressive government, is to get rid of the unionists as a whole and have a minimum programme that everyone unites on. Why that's so significant is that is accredited to C.D. Greaves, one of the leading members of the Colony Association in Britain. That idea of using a progressive government, progressive politics against the unionists is accredited to C.D. Greaves as being his invention, that he invented that. Whereas actually there's evidence in that book, and that was where the latest chapter I had published talking about this. There's evidence that actually the civil rights movement as an idea, the tactic of the civil rights movement of a cross-class or an anti-unionist front emerges in an interwar period from the beginnings of the state itself, actually, and that's where the future research, or what I'm really working on, flows into, is about the history of the Northern Ireland state, 2021 for the 100th anniversary, but also about the long civil rights movement and where the labour movement fits into the civil rights movement, because it's in the struggles that they field with and that they lose an awful lot of in the interwar period. That's where the roots of then the successes of the civil rights movement in the 1960s actually I think then emerged from, because you have all this evidence and all this experience. So for example, Betty Sinclair, who's in this book as one of the woman female trade unionists, guess who's the chair of the Civil Rights Association in Northern Ireland? Betty Sinclair. She'd already been involved in lots of democratic struggles and fights in the 1930s and the Second World War, and so it's the 1960s I think that where that then really gets expressed, or where that really gets taken up. Actually, but that's where I will leave it at that, and hopefully I haven't bored you too much with the detail of the book and everything as well. But thank you for listening to that as well.